Okay, so the other day we talked about ridges, which are places where the crust is moving away from each other. Today, what we're going to talk about are trenches. Um, Trenches are going to be really deep places in the seafloor. They're actually going to be the deepest places in the ocean. You can see that picture in the center is showing how deep that trench is in comparison to other things that are around on the seafloor. And that is actually the deepest ocean trench. Um, These are formed because two plates are going towards one another, and one of those plates are going underneath the other. Just like before, we talked about how there's other names for this, and we're going to get to that in a second. But I want to first talk about how you know which plate is going to go underneath the other. So the one plate that's going to go underneath the other is always going to be the one that's more dense. Depending on what the plates are made up of, depends on which one is more dense. We've talked about how oceanic crust is always going to be more dense than continental crust. So oceanic crust will always be the one that goes underneath. Whereas if two oceanic crusts are going towards one another, then it depends on which one's going to be colder. And it actually ends up being which one is older too, because we found out that the older the plate is, the longer it's been away from the heat source. So the colder it is, making it more dense than the other younger oceanic crust. So if it's oceanic versus, as you can see in this picture, in the bottom picture, you can see the oceanic crust is going underneath the continental crust. And then the one in the top right, you have two oceanic crusts. You can see the one on the left side is going to be the older and colder crust, so it's more dense, so it's going underneath. And then the younger one is the one on the right, where you can kind of see that little volcano that's there in the island arc. So again, the other names. So because the plates are going towards one another and one is going underneath, we say that the plate is being subducted, or we call these things subduction zones. Another name you may have heard in middle school is that they're convergent plate boundaries. So when you go through and look at the pictures on the bottom, all of those places can be called locations where we're going to see trenches, because one plate is being subducted underneath the other. Those are all subduction zones. Those are all convergent plate boundaries. So all of those blue areas, or the lines on the one graph or picture, are going showing all the places where the plates are going towards one another and creating those trenches. No matter what trench zone you're looking at, you're going to see a couple different things. You're always going to see that trench, because that's formed because the two plates are hitting each other. Because the plates are hitting each other, we can see that there's going to be a lot of earthquakes that are happening here, because those plates are going through and colliding and running into each other. You're basically taking two chunks of rocks and just rubbing them next to each other. Here's something you may not have thought of, but it's not going to be right on the trench, but a little bit further away, you're going to go through and see. So if my trench is right here, a little bit further out, you're going to see this volcano or this island arc, or same thing down here. You're going to see this volcano and this volcanic arc that's on a continent. That happens because maybe 10, 20, 30 miles away, probably a little more than that actually. But when the trench or the crust that's getting subducted gets far enough in the earth, it's going to get so hot that it's going to start to melt. And that melting, because it has like water on it, that melting actually comes straight up to the surface. And that's why we get some volcanoes. So again, this oceanic crust is going down. It gets deep enough, it's going to melt. And then that magma is going to come up to the top and create these volcanic islands. The only reason the top one is volcanic islands is because there's two oceanic crusts that are colliding. When you look at the bottom one, you have an oceanic and a continent crust. So those, since the oceanic has to go underneath, those volcanoes have to go onto the land or the continent, because that's the other plate that's there. The last thing is something called tsunamis, and that only happens in ocean to ocean. Tsunamis are caused essentially by earthquakes, and when that earthquake happens underwater, it can basically move the ocean because the energy is traveling in all directions. It will actually move the water, and it starts with a small wave and a bigger wave and a bigger wave until it finally hits land, and it's this massive wave that takes out and does a lot of destruction once it gets to the continent. So these are all the different things that we can find at subduction zones. The first video we're going to go through and watch is showing you how deep the Mariana Trench is. You don't really need to worry about the video or the sound to it, so there's nothing really to worry about with that. If I can get through this ad. Okay. So besides the Mariana Trench, there's also another trench as well, the Japan Trench. You can see the divots that are in there. Those are places where the trenches are because the one plate's going underneath the other. The Mariana Trench is right here. You can always tell which plate's being subducted underneath the other one, because when you're going through and looking at it, the plate that's being subductive, remember, we're going to have those volcanoes on the opposite side. So in the Japan Trench picture, the plate that's over on where my laser pointer is going towards the continent, because this one's being subducted. So you can see that there's this volcanic island arc that's right here that's following the exact pattern of the trench. So I know this one's going underneath. When it gets underneath, it's starting to melt and it's creating this volcanic island that's here. Same thing with the Mariana Trench, that this one is going towards the island, and then you can see there's this volcanic arc that's right there along the side. The last piece is going through and looking at what happens if two continents go towards each other. So we talked about what happens if ocean goes towards each other, ocean continent. Well, the last one is continent, which can happen. So if two continental plates collide with each other, neither of them is really going to go underneath. What will happen is they'll actually just push against each other and crush into each other, and crush so much it essentially makes a mountain range. So it's actually uplifting the continental crust, and it's almost like a car crash where things are just colliding with each other, and then all the stuff kind of jumbles up together. That's what's going to happen, and then you can see mountain ranges form afterwards.